Anniversary Collection exhibition featuring new acquisitions, and we are very pleased to be collaborating with Poetry Ireland on this series of poetry encounters. This is the fourth in the series of four where artists are featured in conversation with poets and discuss their work together and share ideas of exchange and insights. This has been an incredibly rewarding series for us here at Butler Gallery, with a rich exchange of ideas, bouncing back and forth from poet to artist. I think most of you who have been coming to us regularly have found it thought-provoking. It has been such an interesting forum to learn more about the working process of both the artist and the poet and their lives, and I think we've learned a lot. No doubt today's session will do forward the same. I'm delighted to welcome Liz Kelly of Poetry Ireland, who will introduce Gerard Smyth, whom we're delighted to have here today. Very welcome, Gerard. I will just give you a little background bio on Anita. We are sitting in front here of her work Matrix Citizen, 2015, from her 2016 exhibition at Butler Gallery. Anita was born in the Netherlands and based in Dublin. She makes drawings, installations, films and animations. Recently her work has been exhibited at the Irish Museum of Modern Art Dublin, Jane Lombard Gallery New York, Columbia Circle Shanghai, Riverside Art Museum Beijing, Refuge 21C Museums Hotel Arkansas in Cincinnati, Pogiali and Bocconi Gallery Florence, Groener Gallery Dublin, Stedelijk Museum. It goes on and on. But there is one, her next solo exhibition, To the Edge of Your World, will open in Centre Culturel d'Irlandaise in Paris in April. So Anita is preparing for that and heading off very soon to install that show. It's very exciting. And the exhibition will tour to the Netherlands and the USA. Until 2014, she was a lecturer in fine art in TU Dublin, where she also served as head of fine art from 2004 to 2006. And Anita was elected as a member of Aidstone in 2005. I just want to mention there's a really lovely catalogue. We have a few copies available of Anita's work, a real lovely back catalogue of the work that's available in the bookstore if anyone's interested later. I'll pass you on to Liz Kelly. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Anna. I'm very welcome everybody again. It's lovely to see you here for this fourth and final poetry encounter at the Butler Gallery, and hopefully we'll do lots more with the Butler Gallery. We very much enjoyed working with Anna and the team here, who are amazing. Gerard Smyth is a poet, critic and journalist, perhaps best known for his work as poetry editor at the Irish Times, but he's also a published poet of 8 collections of poetry. And Gerard has worked quite frequently with visual artists on publications, including Sean McSweeney on the Enno River, We Liked Here Beside the River with Donald Teskey, and After Easter with Brian Maguire. So a poet who frequently works across art forms, and then particularly with visual artists. So we're very interested and looking very much forward to the conversation with Anita today. He was recipient of the 2012 O'Shaughnessy Poetry Award at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, and co-editor of If Ever You Go, a map of Dublin poetry and songs with Daedalus Press. So over to you, Jerry. I think we're going to start with a poem that we're all looking forward to.
Yeah. Just by way of general, Anita and I met for the first time a week ago, and basically to kind of discover what commonality we had, what we shared, and place emerged as the central theme in both our works. So we'll come back to that, because I'm going to read 2 poems that will kind of lead into other bits of conversation. The poem that I'll begin with is called Taken. And it is a poem about loss. Now, I want to emphasize Anita's work on the theme of loss is universal. My poems tend to be local, but one finds the universal in the local, as I think anyone who's read Paddy Kavanagh would know. This poem arose out of a long series of conversations I had with the poet Thomas Kinsella, whom I revered, and who was he was my first poet, my first living poet. Of course, we had dead poets. I'm of a vintage when we only had dead poets in school. But Tom was one of the first, and many of you may remember the Soundings anthology. It was one of the great privileges of my life to befriend him. We shared a Dublin topography, and a lot of the conversation was about what kept disappearing from that urbanscape. So this is called Taken for Tom Kinsella. First, the city planners took away the old street, along with neighbours who had seen tragedy and farce. They took away the barber shop, sweet shop, sweet shop, the grocery on the corner that mainly sold bread and milk, butter from a marble slab, and through the colder months, bundled sticks that burned to ash in the fires of New Row. They took away the stables in the back lanes of Budlia, the clotheslines and window ledges holding pots of geraniums, the shoe factory, and the shortcut to the block of flats named after an Easter patriot. They took away all clues of history and tradition, the hiding places and escape routes the rebel Irish used, the sites of execution, the enclave of refuge for Huguenots who turned cloth to money. They disturbed the dust that lay on the handiwork of ancient guilds, pulled up foundations buried since the first strangers put a name on what they saw. They took away the cradle school that was half for girls and half for boys, and left no trace of the picture house where the patrons paid half price to see Jim Hawkins sail in search of Treasure Island. And I'll follow that with quite different poem. That poem refers to Huguenots and Huguenots finding refuge, as they did in the part of Dublin that I grew up on, the Liberties. And I grew up with near Weaver's Hall, Weaver's Square. Their legacy still remained in my childhood, and they were still spoken of. There was a special part of St. Patrick's Cathedral that was given to them for services when they fled the persecutions in France and Belgium. This poem is about a different modern day persecution. It was written watching the images of refugees from Syria. It was around the time that Aleppo, I suppose, was bombed to shreds. I found an old poem. The Italian poet Eugenio Montale had written a poem called Syria in the 1950s, and it seemed prophetic. There were 3 lines in it which I use as an epigraph for this poem. An arrow of blood upon a stone pointed the way to Aleppo, and that was written in the 1950s. At the same time that these images were, I was thinking of these images that were on our nightly screens, television screens. The artist Brian Maguire visited Aleppo and produced a huge body of paintings showing the ruins of that city. Very, very powerful images. And some of the lines in the poem, it's just a 2-stanza poem, draw from the imagery of those paintings. News from Aleppo for Brian Maguire. In Aleppo, even the ghosts are gone from their ghost haunts. In a city drained of all its colours, there is no trace of sisters and brothers. They have vanished or departed, daring to sail in leaky vessels. They have crossed wide seas to look for a place of rest, a last resort. But what they get is not the kind of sanctuary Scripture suggests. No one says, "Come in." If they drown on the shores of Europe, they rise again in fishermen's nets. If they pass through customs checks, The hands of body searchers reopen their wounds. The way they came will soon again be someone else's last resort, a route across frontiers, away from where blood upon a stone foretold what was yet to come, the news we read today. I noticed in the information for your forthcoming exhibition in Paris, there's actually a reference to the news of today and how tied into the news of today your own work is, and the body of work you've been making over the last few years, particularly since the passes of foreign countries. So.
Yeah. When Jerry and I met last week and we spoke about things and trying to find a commonality, and Jerry said our place and being in this place now. I mean, I can say a lot of things about place, but being in the Butler Gallery, in 2016 I had a show here where that drawing is from, and the show, and in relation to the poem you just read about Aleppo, about the Syrian refugee crisis, I made this exhibition that started in 2014, 2015, and in 2015 we all saw these images streaming across our computer, TV, and you know, these days, since years now, we witness invasions, violence in every part of the world, refugee crisis, live on our screens. So as I was watching that, I mean, I was always interested in humanity, obviously, but issues, you know, that occur in particularly life today. And I just watching that, and I felt very compelled as an artist to do something with those images. I had used silhouettes in my work, and so I started to gather all these images of these people. And there was one particular image that struck me, and I could still see it in my mind, still have the photo of it, of this woman with two of her kids, and a plastic bag. And I mean, we all remember those images of these people walking into Europe, so to speak. And I thought that could just be me and my two kids when they were young. And I have a photograph of myself with my two kids holding them as I came off the train in the Netherlands to visit my brother. And I said, it's just like that. And all their belongings are in this one plastic bag. So it made me aware of my place where I was at that moment, in a very comfortable chair, sitting in front of my screen in my studio, looking at this place, this crisis unfolding from Syria, all these displaced people looking for a better world and a safer place, particularly a safer haven. So I made this exhibition called Citizen, that was inspired by the refugee crisis. And a refugee crisis for me is a very intense and a violent form of displacement. I mean, displacement, the opposite to place, happens in all of our lives. Like it happens, you know, from child into adolescence, you become displaced in a psychological way. And we think about it in a geographical way. It's much easier to see it like that. And so refugees are displaced in a geographical way, but they're also displaced very much so in a psychological way. So through my own migration, coming here in the 80s, I'm here now, can't believe it's like 40 years. I came for a year, and I didn't emigrate from the Netherlands. I came for a year. I finished art college, and I thought this would be, you know, great. Like, I wanted to go to France, but I was in love with an Irishman, an Irish musician. So we came here for a year, I thought, and then I thought, well, I go back or whatever. So anyway, a year led to another year and another year, and I got into teaching. So after many years, about 7 years, somebody said to me, after 7 years, you need to decide whether you're going to stay or you make this your home, or you're going to leave, you go back or go somewhere else. And then I thought, I'm going to stay for a bit longer. So what I realize what it does is, like somebody like you who's so rooted in inner city Dublin, I had left one place for another, and so it's unavoidable. You start thinking like, okay, so who am I? Am I still Dutch, or does it matter? Or, you know, do I feel more Irish? Like these days, you know, these years, I feel more Irish than Dutch. I feel much more at home here than in the Netherlands. When I go back to the Netherlands, I'm like, you know, the odd one out. I speak Dutch, of course. I speak Dutch still, but with an accent, people say sometimes. It's very funny. So you kind of neither, and you're both at the same time. So I feel I've become this amalgam, and I started looking at, stop me if I talk too much. And I started looking at, you know, place, very much place, and displacement. So there are so many people who are not rooted in one particular place, but who had to, who were forced to move, or, you know, I moved because of my own initiative. And what does it do to people? So, and to understand actually what it does to people who are forced to flee because of violence and war. And it's an increasing phenomenon in our world. So how do we deal with that? How do we find a common humanity, or, you know, common ground, the ethics of witnessing all of this? So that, in a nutshell, is what I deal with. But place, I was saying earlier on to Gerard that, you know, if we think of place, like everybody can, you know, fill that in. If you think of space and place, place is actually a space that is endowed with value, with meaning. So place is often where you live, where you make your home. And then in my work, I also started looking at what do refugees do when they leave? There are these memories, they are still attached to where they come from. How do you take home with you? You know, how do you translate that? And so all these questions, you know, permeate my work.
Well, I'm quite the opposite, I suppose. That was the other thing. You left 40 years ago, and I never left. I remember talking to Lee Murphy about him, the first editor to publish my poems, David Marcus, wrote a memoir about Cork, and he said where he grew up, and he said he never got too big for his roots. Well, in a way, I think I never got too big for my roots. And Dublin has always been very central to my work, mainly because it took possession of me at a very early age. In the anthology that Liz mentioned, If Ever You Go, which was a gathering of poems set in Dublin by a very large number of poets, known and not so well known, I explained one of the early. My father, who was a quintessential Dubliner, I'm probably not a quintessential Dubliner because my mother was from County Meath, and the same Thomas Kinsella, whom I spoke about a few minutes ago, more than once reminded me. He said he had Wicklow, Wexford connections. We're not real Dubliners, but we are. I used to give out when I'd see a review of one of my books, and the reviewers would only focus on the poems that were about Dublin. And Dennis, the wonderful late Dennis O'Driscoll, gave out to me one time, and he said, "Stop, you have a calling card. Be very grateful you have a calling card, and Dublin is your calling card." There's a Birmingham poet called Roy Fisher, and I picked up a phrase he used. He said about Birmingham, he's written a lot about Birmingham. He said, "Birmingham is what I think with," and I think probably Dublin became a place I think with. I have to think through Dublin. But I was talking about my father. My father insisted on every Sunday morning from my earliest memory, which goes back to possibly the age of 5, he took me on what he called a ramble through his Dublin. And it was kind of Joycean. And in fact, I didn't realise until many years later that we passed the house on Usher's Island where the dead was set every single Sunday morning. He had the same route, and I think the reason he had the same, I joke about this, he was a Guinness brewery worker, and the brewery is very central. It's the great citadel on our local Dublin 8 landscape. He was a brewery worker, and much later in life, indeed, he was gone. I used to joke that when he wasn't working on a Sunday, he had to make sure the brewery was still there. So he walked around, he circuited the brewery. But I mean, I've been very grateful to have been given the city. Now, I must say that the collaboration with Sean McSweeney was about County Meath, because the commission was basically to the two of us. He was to produce works of art. He had never painted. He grew up in County Meath until the age of 6. When his father died, then he left. When he and I, 10 years ago, were working on the book, he still had his childhood house in County Meath. So I say in the introduction to the Yellow River that I was twice blessed. I had been given 2 places and an utterly urban experience growing up, smelling the Liffey sediment and the Guinness hops, and at the same time having this annual release to a small farm in County Meath, and they were sort of really wonderful. There's a phrase that Elizabeth Bowen, who came from a totally different background to my own, grew up somewhere around Baggot Street, but left it in childhood, I think. She speaks about the power of emotional memory. Mm-hmm. And I think a place carries that. Yeah. In fact, she said about, and I think this explains my attachment in some way, all my emotional memory exists in those 2 places. And it can be so powerful that, it seems at times you can simultaneously live in the past and live in the present,
And the older we get, the more we do.
Well, the older we get, the deeper it goes.
Yeah, the more memories you have.
But I think I said to you, I love quoting an American poet called Linda Paston, who in one of her poems asked the question, how much of memory is imagination?
Yes.
I think as we do get older, we impose myth and imagination on reality.
Yeah, we do.
But there's no myth or imagination in the themes in your own work. There's a terrible reality there when you're looking at, the swarms of refugees. Yeah. And how you represent them in the work. I mean, you were talking to me about the miniature silhouettes that you make. That must be extremely laborious.
I started cutting them by hand, but I gave that up because that was not practical, like the first installation I did. But the scale in my work, and that ties in with, when you look for meaning, like, we talk about place, like it's a space that we endow with meaning and value. So, and a lot of times that's what, as I said, home. But it requires an intimacy. There's an intimacy attached to that. And the scale in my work, like the drawing there, you cannot see what it is from a distance. And making the show that was in the Butler Gallery here, and the way I conceived it, as I mentioned earlier on, from my comfortable armchair, I thought, the psychological reality of this violence and what these people are going through, how can we witness that in an ethical way? And so that distance, like literally that distance, is also psychological distance that we have with the other that's miles and miles away. So, and I was aware of, like, I can turn off the TV, or I can turn off the news, and I can just continue on with my life, which we have to do as human beings, but that also has this, alienation of reality. So in the work, what I use scale to draw you in. In these large installations, like, there'll be a lot of very small objects, and these silhouettes, they look abstract from a distance, and then people go like, oh my God, what is that? And then as you come closer and you become, intimate in the work, with the work, the stories, I hope, reveal themselves. So that is a way of drawing people in, and with your own history and your own, place in the world, you interpret the work. And that relationship for an artist is extremely important, because that kind of completes the work. Like, everybody here comes from a different place, so everybody looks at the work and establishes a different relationship with the work. And I think, when we talk about place, which is a good common denominator in our works, and I think in everybody's life, is, how do we, for me also, it's like, probably because of my own migration, but also becoming aware of time. We also spoke about time. If you talk about memory and the past, and the older you get, your past becomes bigger and bigger, and there's more and more, like, it's this reservoir of information. And, for me, it's like a vocabulary I can work with, but it changes all the time. Like, if you become aware of time, there's this concept of time, like the durational aspect of time. Nothing stays the same. What I've said is already on tape, it's in the past. So there's no moment, there's no pause for anything. Everything we do and experience is already part of our past. So to understand that, like, I'm fascinated by those issues, how they affect a sense, like time, how that affects a sense of place. That, it's like things we move through. I experience it as we move through time, like time is a landscape. And the same with place. And for years, in hindsight, looking back, I was happiest in a car. Because in a car, you're nowhere. You're neither here, you're neither there. So you're in between. And I've discovered that is a space, a place. It's not a place, it's a space that you move through that's really comfortable for me, because, and it's a very good space for an artist, because you can observe this way and you can observe that way. And so that's, moving from one place to another, like the Netherlands to Ireland, has been it's very enriching for me as an artist and as a human being. So because I can work with all these aspects that have become part of my life. And so, and I'm absolutely fascinated by somebody like you who's so rooted. You mentioned the word rooted. Like, we all need to be rooted. We all need to feel rooted somewhere. We all want to belong to a place, to what we call home, or where we feel comfortable.
Yeah, it is. The rootedness is important. And I had to concede when at the time I was writing the Mead poems. I was very fearful of that, and initially I said no, because I had actually written about Mead. I wrote my first poems in County Meath. I didn't write them in Francis Street in Dublin, and I wrote them in the summer of 1968. I have a very, very clear memory of bringing some poetry books with me down or up rather, I always say, down to the farm in Meath, and really was getting into poetry in that summer. But I think it was probably passed on, you know, that I was talking about my Joycean father. You know, if there's one thing he left me, it was that. And I'm really grateful for what he called his rambles, which as I got older, of course, I didn't want to participate in, and I broke away at some point. But I like the idea of the flaneur. I mean, I will, if I do leave Dublin to go somewhere else, it'll only be to a city. My poor children were never in their lives on a package holiday. They had to walk around cities like Rome and Paris, which I hope they felt know the benefit of. I mean, we were talking about Paris as well when I went on the residency to Paris, where Sheila Prachka was the director there at the time, and she said, "No, we won't stop you when you're leaving to see how much work you've done," and it's probably just as well, because I spent the entire number of weeks I was there just simply walking the city and letting it soak into me. And I did write the poems when I got back to Dublin. Now, I'm not rooted to Paris. I only knew Paris through literature, really, and through art, because it's probably the most painted city in the world. But to experience it in that intensive way was wonderful, and I'd love to do that in so many other cities. But come back to your issue about time. There's a very limited amount of it, you know. But in terms of another aspect of commonality, I suppose I was at an interview with the wonderful short story writer Claire Keegan about 2 weeks ago, and at the end, when there was a question and answer, there was the inevitable, you know, what inspires you, how do you get going? And she simply said, it all begins with an image. It all begins with an image. And you know, it's William Carlos Williams, the modernist poet from Paterson, New Jersey, who, as I said, studied art as well, said we can have no thoughts without images. You know, everything is an image. And it works, as an artist, it works for you that way. And you know, the imagists, that group of poets, that school of poetry, they weren't called images for nothing, images for nothing. We depend on imagery, it nurtures us. And this, I think, coming back to my Dublin element, this is what I was given right outside the window of the house I was born in and grew up in. I was given a set of images. This is what I picked up initially. The streets around me. Oddly enough, in my first 3 books, there are poems about Dublin and about place, but I don't name a single place for some reason, which I wrote an essay about this one time. I don't know why, but the naming is so very important. You know, if you get it wrong, I mean, I think the great example of it is I mean, Heaney has named places in Derry and Horsh and Toom and places like that. Kinsella himself has named all those streets around Inchicore and Kilmainham where he grew up. But in subsequent, in every book I think I've published in the last 4 or 5 books, places are named. The associative power of a named place, you know, is really important. But you know, I often think if Kavanagh had got it wrong with Raglan Road, you know, on Morehampton Road would not have worked. You know, I saw. It's getting it. And that's about musicality, I suppose, in terms of poetry.
But when you mention images, we also need language, of course. Like I may have images in my, you know, to make work, or you know, ideas, but at the same time we have to put, and which visual art is a language, visual language, but you also have to put language onto it that we all understand and speak. So artists are very grateful for poets. You know, poetry sometimes it's like a reference to what you paint. So the image is not the equivalent, but it's not a translation, but it's like a reverent. It's a different dimension. But poetry comes much closer to visual arts than, I suppose, prose or music sometimes does. But music is also very abstract. You know, like a lot of times, I don't know if you're asked that, but you know, an artist will be asked that, but what does it mean? What do you mean with, you know, what you do? Because we think in images and then put language, we construct our language and construct meaning to it, but it's very hard to get that out of the image alone. You're going to read.
I'm going to read a poem merely because it comes back to the image, and it was a poem after we completed the project, The Yellow River, and I saw the work that Sean had produced in the setting of the solstice in Navan. I could only then write this poem, but he said, I remembered something he said to me about memory. He said that yellow is the colour of memory. Now, you as a different kind of artist may have a different sense of that. And I just thought it was a wonderful, because he does have he's associated with green and blue, but he does have some wonderful yellow paintings. But watching, it was the closest I ever got to watching a visual artist work. I don't mean I was in the studio behind him, but particularly on our treks around County Meath, when he'd get out of the car and he would just stand looking. You know, I'd seen him do this in Sligo, particularly looking out to the sea. And obviously, I think this was written after Sean died, actually, because it's in his memory. It's called His Deep Gaze. His deep gaze finds what goes unnoticed by the eye of the casual observer, the landscape's marginalia, its transient colours in the ragged boughs of beech and elm, the gleaming river like an antique sketch, the tilt of the land when the plough has unsettled it. The yellow fields are the colour of memory. The apple trees of September remind him of the first day at school. Horizons of unbroken stillness became his holy scripture. The great Atlantic's tide keeps brewing, and the foam on the shore is as white as a garden of gathered snow. The winter moon, with a face so wan, looks like it's wearing a silk kimono from old Japan. And homelight in a window, discovered by chance, appears again on the studio canvas. The homelight, I took him to see the house my mother had been born in, which was my grandmother's house. It's no longer in the family. And he produced a wonderful painting just of the homelight in the window. But he also did something else, which I suppose is the power of art. I had, in The Yellow River, there's a poem about an elm tree that died, and I loved it. As a child and an adolescent, I loved that elm tree. It cast dapples on a laneway outside the farmyard. It also cast dapples into the country kitchen table. And I remember my own kids were young, going down one time. The tree was gone. It had Dutch elm. It was a period of Dutch elm. But in a painting he did, he restored the two elm trees to the laneway, which, you know, is again how you can play with the image, I suppose. Do you like playing with images?
Do I like playing with images?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I do. Like, I mean, not one, you know, and I'm forever, like, doubting what I do. Like, you know, if I look at that drawing that I did years ago, I could have done it differently. I could have done it this way or that way. So you play with images, and coming to that image takes other images to construct that. So it's doubting. It's more like doubting, like whether, as I mentioned earlier, there's not one truth. There are many, many, many truths, and little truths rather than one truth. But if I may, I just want to say something about place. Like a place, I think is fascinating. Theme, we can talk for hours about it. Like place, your very specific place, but we set that as well, through the very personal experience, you touch on, or very local experience, you touch on universal experiences. And, bringing that in my work, or looking at it in my work, is to look at what I, as I said, I have lots of questions, no answers, only questions. And I'm interested in the psychological damage that is inherent, as you probe, or as I probe, like human tragedy that is inherent in these stories of refugee crises, of, if I think of, like, is it 85 million people displaced now? But, if you don't understand the local, the importance and the beauty and the rootedness of being in the local area, what we call, place and home, we don't have an appreciation of the universal. And if you think about place, like place is liberties, and inner Dublin, what you wrote about in throughout your life, but it's also Ireland, it's also Europe, it's also planet Earth. And then if you look at all these different perspectives, place like Earth or Ireland, we share that living here, we share being part of Europe, we share being part of a very volatile world, being this planet, and so maybe I remember as a kid, like trying to imagine when I would try and go to sleep, what it would be like if you're dead. These kind of big questions when you're a child. And I would have this image that I would hover around planet Earth and for a split second, it was this total sensation that I had, and then it was gone. And I don't know where that image came from, but if, in a way, like if you look from a perspective like the Earth's point of view, we're all part of this place, we're all connected in that sense, that we have a very different, not a different set of rules or ethics, but a different experience and different sense of responsibility and sharing of, shared humanity. So place is really interesting. Like, if you could ask somebody what does it mean to you, you get all these different.
Well, it's very important to remember it's you're not just writing about the physical fabric of a place.
No, yeah.
It's the history of the human presence in a place as well, and in a part of the city that I keep saying I grew up on the foundation stones of Dublin. That's really very important. I mean, the layers of history. And it's I think one of the important things that art is for generally, whether it's the visual art or the written art, is memorialization.
Yes.
And it's almost a duty of the artist and to memorialize on behalf of those who probably don't have a voice, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And that place is about community. Reputably, we had a very close-knit community in basically the inner city, south inner city. My family went back 3 generations, I think, my Dublin family. So it's kind of working and writing on behalf of them and the community. And I certainly had a very strong sense of that community. and there were other things that were an aspect. There's a great traditional music, you know, in the air, the Potts family, the chieftains kind of, and that here and there, not in poems I'm reading today, but comes into the work, you know. It's, but we're not, but I mean, I've had friends who just couldn't wait to get out, couldn't wait to be gone, like that. And I suppose that, in truth, if you ask me, do I understand that mindset? I probably don't.
That people want to get away.
People want to get away, to go. But then, you know, you take someone like Joyce, who couldn't wait to get away, was obsessed with the city all his life, you know, and wrote about it.
But maybe in, you know, absence of place, you become more aware. Like I actually, being away from the Netherlands, I became more aware of what it is to be Dutch. And, you know, rather than maybe if I was still there, if I see friends who are still living there, who haven't moved, like I'm aware of certain, you know, trades and qualities, etc., you know, bad or good, that you go like, oh yeah, that's, the Dutch are like that, and maybe you become more aware of your own, you know, part, that's part of you. And then of course there's so many Irish, there's millions of Irish all over the world who've made home elsewhere, but are still very much, you know, Irish, and have a huge, very strong connection to Ireland.
Well, I was very much aware that on my mother's side of the family, four of her older siblings had got in the 1920s, early 20s, had gone to America. I think I have more relations in America than I have on this island.
Yeah.
And one thing I've noticed that from generation to generation, the links with Ireland are lessening all the time.
Yeah.
And if she had gone, I wouldn't be here now, you know, I would be somewhere else.
You'd be in America.
I'd be in America.
Be an American poet.
Well,
You would write about different things, maybe.
Yeah,
it's funny, isn't it, to think about that? Yeah.
Gerard, can we have a few more poems from yourself, and then maybe we'll open up the conversation to the
sure,
group.
yeah. Actually, I'll if I can find it. The poem about.
And you have a poem of Anita as well, don't you?
I have a poem, yeah, that I do look at poems. I read, well, not look at poems, I read poetry, and sometimes it's really useful, like, and I've used titles from poems in my work, so yeah, I'll read a poem, yeah.
I mentioned 1968, which is what, 55 years ago. The last poem is about that summer that I began to write, the last poem, The Yellow River. It's called The Year I Turned to Poetry. The year I turned to poetry, 16 years of dreaming were all I had, when my first muse put the scribe's pen in my hand. Now my life is 4 times that, and I am back where it all began, looking for the midden that expanded like the universe in a corner of the yard, under daytime's silver birches, nighttime's bottleneck of stars. It was here my forefathers laboured for years, grinding hard clods into fine clay. Their house of sanctuary still stands, but rooms have been added, and I cannot find the window where they scanned the Milky Way. It was here I first looked for words to describe the sacred and absurd. I looked in the furrows, the stubble, beneath pine needles lying where they fell, under leaves that dropped from the branches of the elm. And you have a your nest that you found in your mother's garden, which you disassembled, which in itself is a wonderful kind of image.
Yeah, it's also violent.
Metaphor as
yeah.
well.
Yeah.
2 years at the beginning of the pandemic, I was walking through the Liberties.
Mm-hmm.
And the house I was born in and lived in for the first 6 years of my life had been literally, strange to say, I left as a ruin for the last 25 years, but I noticed a sign for it to be pulled down and replaced with another hotel in Dublin. You know, the house wasn't that there was another house adjacent to it. But I literally watched, I went back to watch it being disassembled. They did it brick by brick rather than bringing in a wrecking ball for some reason.
Yeah.
And when I was looking at the images of your dismantling, I thought of this poem, which I wrote, I suppose, as the house was going. I'll just finish with this. My father's house. For years, I watched its decline and fall. First there was a crack in the wall, then a hole in the roof. The crack moved from room to room. The hole grew and gave a better view of the dark clouds and touch of blue. One day I looked and it was gone. I felt a sudden nostalgia of the floors of cold linoleum, the telltale step that creaked in the hall, the shuddering pipes, the window where my father sat reading the crimes of Agatha Christie. In winter, he watched the way the wintry sun came in to light the dusty surfaces, illuminate the bones of his late night feast, the stack of newspapers at his feet, one for each day of the week, one for every catastrophe. But the time came when nobody was home, the stove unlit, the chimneys cold. One day I turned and saw nothing there but thin air, a new wasteland. No trace of the proletarian life of those who hoped they had riches stored up in paradise. Want to?
Oh yes, I have a poem. It's just briefly about the video that Gerard refers to, Nest it's called, and it's just anecdotally, it's a nest, bird's nest. I don't know what bird it was. It could be a crow or when I was in the Netherlands one summer, there was a storm all of a sudden came up, and we were just leaving to go to the boat in Rotterdam to go back through it, Britain to Ireland. And we saw this thing on the grass, and so we ran out, and it was a bird's nest. It fell out of a tree because of the strong wind. And I put it in a box because we were in the car, put it in the car, and it was in my studio for 12 years. And I knew I wanted to do something with it, but I didn't know what. But it was so intriguing, and looking at the construction of this bird. And like a nest is like a very archetypal, very primal form of home, you know, building a home. And then with this exhibition that I did, that you saw, The Past is a Foreign Country, I took the bird, the nest apart, like one twig after another. And it was filmed in real time, so speeded up a little bit. But so you see the nest is like at the end, it's just debris and dust, there's nothing. But you can never put it back together the way it was. And that to me was a beautiful metaphor for, like, you leave home, like so many of us do, or, you know, as you leave home as a young person, and you can never reconstruct home or place in the same way. It, you know, you might try and reconstruct it, but it's always something else. So this poem, I've used a line out of this poem. It's called the line, "Wherever I am what is missing." And that is about that displacement. So wherever I am, there's always a part of me that's not here. It's by an American poet called Mark Strand, and the title of the poem is called "Keeping Things Whole." In a field, I am the absence of field. This is always the case. Wherever I am what is missing. When I walk, I part the air, and always the air moves in to fill the spaces where my body's been. We all have reasons for moving. I move to keep things whole. It's a beautiful little poem, and it just like those lines to me at the time just said exactly. These I used it for a series of work I made during the pandemic when we were all homebound. And these are small sculptures, and it's all about the negative, empty spaces within those sculptures. So I won't keep talking.
Just thought we might open it up to see
Yeah.
if anyone have any questions for you. Bob and Sean, we'll go with your Bob.
Mm-hmm.
I think you alluded to it earlier, the question is a thing with musicians, you have to suffer to sing the blues, also different ways to suffer. But when it comes to money and finances, somebody who's just getting by probably like $14,000 a year, and they're an artist or a poet, is there an advantage or a disadvantage to that? And then on the other hand, if money is no worries, and resources, investments, or whenever money is just not, it's always there when you need it. Does that affect your work adversely, or is it a positive towards your work?
To have money, it's a positive. But is that your question?
Yeah. So does money affect your work?
Well, I laugh when someone suggests to me they're going to live on poetry. You don't live on poetry. I was a journalist all my life. In fact, I got into journalism through having published some poems when I was still in school. So money wasn't kind of a consideration ever. And I just got on with writing. I compartmentalized the two, I have to say. And then finally, and again in an essay I wrote, had to admit that the practice of journalism was a huge influence on my technique and style as a poet. But I had a day job, and any poet I know, I can only immediately think of one. Seamus Heaney taught all his life, you know. The poets who are librarians, with poetry, you have to have a day job.
I had a day job
You were
for
teaching?
years. I was teaching for years. But I gave that up because loved my students, loved the job, but it just took over my brain. But I mean, talking about money, you need money to make exhibitions. It's as simple as that, and to make work. So if you're a sculptor, and depending on the materials you use, that costs money. To run a studio costs money, to have equipment costs money, and then making an exhibition is different to making work. So, you may need to buy stuff, or you need to travel, or, so transport, depending on funding you may get. So you need the funding, that's money, etc. So yeah, you do need money for an artist, you need money to make work. So any money I make through sales goes back into the studio, to run the studio. Yeah. It makes life a bit easier.
Sean, any question?
Yeah. One thing I noticed about both your work was a very strong sense of rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of wrote that when you're
The drawing.
behind you. Jerry just outlined the ragged bows of the beach, and Ellen was just adding assonance and the iambic, could either of you speak a little bit about the importance of rhythm to your work and its effect on the viewer or the listener? Sounds like an incantation thing going on. Conscious.
Well, I mean, there has to be, and this is, I think, beginner poets find this the difficult. It took me a long time to find technique, to find a musical line. I mean, but I, for example, and there was mention at the anthology I did with Pat Bourne, If Ever You Go, we decided we were putting songs in as well as poems. I actually don't differentiate between song and poetry. Can't sing a note. I hope I sing on the page. But it really is important. remember giving I mean, I do essentially write in free verse. Sometimes I like the sonnet form, and although my form is probably the ghost sonnet, it's a form of Gerard Smyth sonnet, but you can play around with the sonnet form. But the musicality and alliteration, all those old-fashioned things that certainly I learned about in school. And there was a lot of advantage to studying the dead poets. I can tell you that they don't do them in schools anymore. I had to do Tennyson and Milton, and I'm very, very grateful. And a lot of Shakespeare. And I am still to this day. I had a wonderful Shakespearean teacher, absolutely wonderful, one of the founders of the Dublin Shakespeare Society. To this day, I'm so grateful that I did so much Shakespeare, because there's fabulous music in the lines of Shakespeare. But there's rhythm in
there's rhythm in my work, yeah. But like rhythm, I would think of it as pattern and repetition. So there's a lot of repetition in my work, and I thought about that, and it's like a vocabulary of bits that I put together. But the repetition is also, and the rhythm is also, of something that you do that I do relentlessly, and I think we all do, is you go over something again and again and again until you find maybe something that approximates the truth, or some sense that you want to get closer and closer to that. And so I think a lot of artists, and maybe poets as well, you write about the same thing over and over, but in different ways. So you reiterate, and that's that repetition and rhythm in my work that goes through all of the exhibitions that I've done.
We were talking earlier about process, and an awful lot of these talks, it's been really interesting to hear about how the crossover is for poets and artists. And both of yours is quite different, but because yours is definitely image, idea, grafting, handwork, lots of repetition. But Gerard, you were also saying that it's about rewriting and rewriting. So it's really a graft at the end of the day. You're both working over long periods of time to maybe you realize an installation and you realize the simplicity of a beautiful little poem, but it takes as much work to realize that.
Yeah. I remember being interviewed one time, I think it was a radio, and the interviewer said, "You don't write long poems." I said, "No, I don't publish long poems, I write long poems." That, in fact, having worked as an editor, that influence on how, it's getting down to the absolute economy, getting down to the absolute essential. I mean, one of the things I continue to do is act as Irish Times poetry editor. It's a funny old post-retirement gig they gave me just to keep me quiet. And so much of the work comes in that I read and I look at it and say, someone's just written this, they put it they emailed it off to me. I do believe in actually putting a poem away. No, I don't do it every single time. And I used to say it in workshops, put it away for 6 months and then come back to it. It really is important.
I do that too.
I don't know whether you have that.
Yeah, I
do that in the
too.
studio.
And I live with the work. So for that reason, will it survive my gaze? And then if I still, I still feel good about it after several months, then I think it's okay. It's a test. But what you say about the economy of, your poems are reduced to make the ones you publish. Like, it's the economy for me of drawing. That's why I draw, and it's mostly with black. That is, very simple means, and this reduction, like reduce, to get to the essence of things, and not dilute it with adding this and that into the mix. But do you come then to an image that you can create, or a story?
But with a poem, and it has to be the same with work of art, what you want to end up with is something that can only be yours, that's authentically yours. it cannot have been someone else's.
Yeah.
And it does take time often, you know, I read a line and I say, oh, I'm trying to be Wallace Stevens here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not Wallace Stevens, you know, you have to keep refining. I mean, I have published poems in collections over the years that I have since rewritten. It just goes on and on. I have been berated in one review for rewriting poems in my, what age? I would have been in my 50s, I suppose. I took poems that I had written in my 20s and rewrote them. Now, maybe that was going a little bit too far. It's a bit like taking an old suit out of the wardrobe that looked fine on you 30 years ago, but you know, it doesn't look so good now. There probably is a limit to when you should stop rewriting, but I do have a habit, and it can be a bad habit at times. But
I think it's good because you change. You're not the same Gerard as you were 40 years ago. So
but maybe you should just leave what you did
Yeah.
40 years ago, but there is the temptation.
Do we have any other questions in the group here? Any burning question? No? I think we've come to a really nice end with that, those few thoughts there. So thank you, Gerard, and thank you, Anita, for that lovely conversation you've had together. It's good to know.
Thank you. Thank you.